Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to another of our BASF lectures at the Center for Anglo-German Cultural Relations. My name is Rüdiger Görner, and it is my particular pleasure tonight to welcome Dr. Heike Zech, the Deputy Director of the Germanisches Nationalmuseum in Nürnberg. As we all know, an integral part of Anglo-German cultural relations is memory culture. And one of the important locations of memory culture, of course, is the museum. And it is a delight for us all, especially for Jana, my co-panelist, and myself, to welcome Dr. Zech back to us, because as it happened, in her capacity as curator, one of the curators at the V&A between 2007 until 2017, she was the first co-supervisor of Jana Riedel's dissertation on Prince Albert and his contribution, decisive contribution to the Great Exhibition 1851. So Heike Zech's record is truly astounding and remarkable, not only because of her numerous publications, quite a number of them with the V&A, but also she is, as Deputy Director of the Germanic National Museum in Nürnberg, at a key place of German memory culture, but also a memory culture that transcends German concerns. Dr. Zech started her academic career in Bamberg University with a PhD on Kaskaden in der deutschen Gartenkunst. Now, this is something which we will not tackle today, I'm sure, but we will discuss other things that have a great deal to do with her main concern, namely research in aspects of the museum culture, the history of collections, and of course the transfer as an element of this particular culture in art and in the crafts. In fact, Heike Zech is one true expert in what one can call the golden grounds of craftsmanship, because craftsmanship is the history of that in its arts and crafts equivalent, as it were, in the German lands, is one of her major research topics. And apart from that, she has also branched out in different areas. For example, in a publication that where she investigated the mosaics in St. Paul's Cathedral. So we have someone as a very special guest here tonight who encompasses, shall we say, a huge range of museum activities. And we are immensely looking forward to your lecture on museum and exhibition culture in Germany and Britain as a comparison. After the lecture, you will have the opportunity to ask questions through the chat, but if you want to use the microphone, you can also do so. Please indicate this to Jana Riedel, and she will promote you to a co-panelist, and then you can speak wide and loud. So for the moment, I think we better switch off all our microphones, and it is a pleasure to hand over to you, Heike Zech, and please, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Professor Görner, and indeed for the very kind invitation. It's great to be back in London, albeit only on the digital floor, as it were, and I hope soon we can meet in person again to continue our conversations face to face and not screen to screen. Nonetheless, it's a pleasure to contribute to your lecture series through this medium, since none of us would have thought we would find ourselves in the dire straits of the pandemic once more, or still in December this year. So I'm afraid we have to deal with that. The topic, as it has been explained, is about Anglo-German museum culture. So it is as much about what museums, exhibitions in the two countries have in common, as it is about what might be different. And I will also explore the reasons why that might be. But first things first, I hope my computer doesn't let me down. It will actually move to the next slide, which it did beautifully earlier. If you talk about England and Germany, you always end up with 1966. And it's the same tonight. And I want to start with this because ever since I returned to Germany, I find myself confronted with questions from both sides of the channel about museum cultures. And there's always, is my feeling, a slight agenda behind that. Is there one that is better? Is there something we can learn from them? Is there something where we excel? And I have to say, and that's why I'm showing you 1966, the famous final of the World Championship. What we're doing tonight is not a competition, it is a comparison. And it wants to bring out what unites us, and also where we fight together, where we play together. And without wanting to stretch the metaphor too far, it is my feeling that the goalposts are moving very fast, and we as museums will be challenged to respond to that. And actually, I do truly believe that the challenges ahead are very fundamental and potentially threatening to the core of museum cultures in both our countries. I should explain that in thinking about the lecture tonight, I was thinking primarily about an audience that has, of course, a very keen interest in memory culture, in museums, not only museums dedicated to art and culture, but also to science, to natural history. And I was maybe thinking slightly more about an audience in England rather than a German audience. I hope that captures you. If not, I would encourage you even more to contribute with your questions to the chat and to make sure that we can discuss what matters to you most. First things first, this is what's on the menu tonight. First of all, I want to have a brief look at challenges that are new, that are current, and which hopefully will go away sooner rather than later. Then I will dive into the comparison proper, looking mostly at museums, how they came to be, what they stand for, what we pursue, and also about special exhibitions as the maybe most powerful product and means of communication that our institutions have to offer. And then as a last little point, which hopefully can encourage discussion as well, I want to look ahead and I want to think about the underlying challenges that we all are facing, and that probably are relevant for universities as well, but maybe are particularly evident in the museum sector. So the current challenges, of course, you cannot move away from that. Anglo-German relations, Anglo-German museum cultures are very, very strongly affected by Brexit. And maybe you have figured out that this circle of stars with one star shooting away is the official symbol for Brexit. And actually, Professor Görner, you might remember that the day after the Brexit vote, we sat together and we were discussing which way does it go. And sadly, and I think I can be upfront about that in this group, Leave won. Of course, I was very much in favor of Remain, because I do truly believe it's absolutely crucial for cultural relations, cultural diplomacy, for our work together. And it does affect museum cultures in many, many ways. They can be quite pragmatic, like how do I get objects through customs that need to go to an exhibition? How can I even order a book from the V&A shop these days if it exceeds £15 in value? Very pragmatic things, very down-to-earth things, but it also affects the bigger picture about the free movement of people, about students choosing to do a year abroad in the respective other country, and deciding that keeping that in mind with their research, with their work, is absolutely relevant and necessary to do. And that, of course, has become more challenging. The second really ongoing concern, and it's turning into a really fundamental and life-threatening concern for museums as well, is the pandemic. And of course, English museums have been much more affected by this financially because of museum business models that are ever so slightly different from your standard public German institution that doesn't depend as much on income generated from commercial activities. And of course, if you think about what happened at the V&A and is still happening, what happens at other institutions, that is in part attributed to the pandemic. These might, of course, not be the only reasons and contributing factors, but it is challenging what we can do as institutions, how we can look after our collections. And I should maybe state at this point as well that there's something that I haven't mentioned in my title. I'm talking about places, about people, about perspectives, but of course underlying, and for me, the defining moment for museums on both sides of the channel are the collections. If we don't have anything to show, we can be a forum, we can be anywhere we meet. What makes our institution special are the collections we work with, that we look after material culture in whichever shape and form, and we have this expertise. And those two factors at the moment make it rather difficult for objects, for expertise, for knowledge to travel as freely, and for discussions to happen as uninhibited as they did 2 years ago. Nonetheless, I do truly hope at least we can meet on the screen. We cannot go to the pub afterwards and continue our conversation as we might have done in a different scenario, but at least we can continue to meet. And I hope and I remain optimistic that we can overcome those two current challenges. Of course, challenges like the pandemic and Brexit have downsides, but they might have benefits as well. Those of you who join us from Germany today, they know that in terms of digitization, German museums are slightly behind, and we certainly have made headway. Thanks to the pandemic, we could dedicate resources quite often and frequently to digitizing collections and also to creating online exhibitions and online content for those who can't join us in person. And that, of course, means reaching audiences internationally, nationally, locally, who just can't make it to the museums as such. And that in itself increases and improves access. And that certainly is a benefit of kind, which doesn't make up for all the downsides. But I just wanted to say there's a silver lining in this as well. Digitization, Brexit, pandemic, none of these words would have meant anything to those two. The power couple of Anglo-German museum cultures. And I'm looking at Jana Riedel because I have no knowledge in comparison to all the work and knowledge you have generated for your PhD and your thesis. And I very much recommend to everyone to have a look at it once it's coming out and because it's published, because you're working on the publication already, I understand. But nonetheless, Victoria and Albert are, of course, absolutely crucial for the development and evolution of museums in England, but also, I would argue, in the German states. And one aspect that makes that quite clear is if you look back at the museum cultures before that. The British Museum was established already in 1753. It opened in 1759, if I'm not very much mistaken. And of course, people collected objects and shared them with select audiences much earlier. I'm showing you two examples, fairly divided between Great Britain and Germany. The Paxton treasure on the left-hand side is a typical example for a cabinet of curiosities created by a gentleman collector, which brought together the world already in the 17th century. It's at Norwich Castle Museum, a rather mysterious picture, which was reconsidered and explored in a fantastic exhibition back in 2018. And it really brings together his personal world and also the world as he knew it already. And as the German counterpart, I'm showing you the famous Vogelsaal, the Birds Hall of the Naturkundemuseum in Bamberg, of the Natural History Museum in Bamberg in Franconia, south of Germany, which was established by the Prince Bishops of Bamberg and stands for this understanding of the world. Even a Catholic bishop wanted to understand how nature works and functions. And these two examples stand for museum culture before something emerges that we would recognize as a museum for the general public today. And I think that switch then really happens with the Crate exhibition and the subsequent museum foundations. These institutions, they had a certain public, they had a certain vision behind it, but they were not as strategically geared at surviving long into the future. Even so, many of them do, as you can see in those. And many of them have found their home and place in one of the large institutions. I've also chosen those two smaller examples because I have to admit that what I mostly do is I will be looking at museums that are national, larger institutions, simply because it's easier to draw comparisons between institutions of that size. But we will also touch upon the many, many smaller museums in both countries. Let's fast forward to 1848. Of course, this year has to be mentioned here as well. And I feel I almost have to apologize for that brutal juxtaposition of a Christmas tree at Windsor Castle, which is, of course, the famous introduction of the German tradition of the Christmas tree into the Anglo-Saxon culture, which now has become a universal and global phenomenon. This is very much the beginning of it, the first card published of the royal family gathering in England around this German tradition. Memory culture of the best kind, of the most lasting kind, but also very much in this kind of Biedermeier vein, which in terms of culture existed, looking back, manifesting folklore, even at the highest level of society. On the other side, we are a couple of months earlier. This is March 1848. I think it's the 19th of March, 1848. So, and it's the barricades of Berlin in front of Berlin Castle, which you can see in the background here. I'm not quite sure you can see my mouse pointer, but maybe you can. And we will come back to this building, obviously, later on, because if there's one museum project that we need to touch upon tonight, it's definitely what is happening at that very location at the moment, which is the Humboldt Forum. In 1848, people were on the barricades fighting for a constitution, fighting for a parliament, fighting for the freedom of press. And as many of you will know, the 1848 revolution in Germany, which also happened simultaneously to revolutions across many parts of Europe. England avoided the revolution as well. The revolution failed in the German states as well. And the idea that there would be a politically united Germany had to wait to become reality for another 20 odd years. In actual fact, there was the Paulskirchen Parliament, which Friedrich Engels described as a parliament for an imaginary country. And that is important to keep in mind for one of the museum foundations that happened briefly afterwards, which I have chosen as one of a mixed double of museum foundations in the early 1850s, just to explore what was possible in both countries. What you can take from that, and of course it's a brutally extreme, and obviously there were Christmas trees in Germany that year as well, is that Germany as a nation has always been uneasy, has been unsettled, and it's something that people question to the present day. What does nation mean? What does it encompass for Germany? And of course that makes the establishment of national institutions and of a shared identity and memory culture extremely difficult, especially if you look forward at what was to come and the terrible turns that history took in Germany. I will touch upon that in a moment. 1851, the Crate exhibition. Rüdiger Görner already mentioned it. Jana Riedel dedicated parts of her thesis to it. Of course, we need to talk about it tonight as well. On the right side, you can see one of the ales of Crystal Palace, showing art and industry from the world, but it was a showcase for the empire, the powerhouse of England at the time, opened by Victoria and Albert, and actually so successful that it would be the most successful blockbuster exhibition to the present day if we would compare it. I think it was about 6 million visitors in less than half a year. I would have to double check the exact numbers. They sort of slightly differ depending on sources, but it's something that basically hasn't been surpassed since in that founding. And the funds created from the Crate exhibition actually support the following project and venture of Prince Albert to the present day. And of course, that is Albertopolis, which you see on the right side of the screen. You've got the Victoria and Albert Museum here. You've got the Natural History Museum, Science Museum, Imperial College, the Royal Albert Hall, and then Hyde Park, where Crystal Palace originally stood. So what he created with the means drawn from the success of the Great Exhibition was a place where people could meet to gain perspective. And that for me is a very simple definition for museums, but also for other places of learning. And the difference to earlier ventures in collecting, in my opinion, is really that this was tailored and targeted at something that we finally recognize as a general audience, and with the impetus to improve the life conditions and to improve industry for more people beyond a certain elitist circle, so to say. And that actually is a model that is very successful to the present day, but it keeps evolving. Just think of the V&A's current ventures, and in East London, the V&A East and other pursuits. All that shows that you can still use that basis, but it needs to be carried forward and evolve for the 21st century. In contrast, this is what happened in Nuremberg. So obviously the building you saw at the beginning is which you can see behind me, is the main facade of the institution I work for today, which dates from the 1990s. But the Germanisches Nationalmuseum, the Germanic National Museum, was also established in 1851. And actually the two museums, the Museum of Manufacture, the early V&A, and the Germanic National Museum, opened the doors to the public within a couple of months from each other. And as you can see, they both have this campus structure with many buildings. You have to find your way around. And I find this print from the 1880s particularly telling, because he shows one thing, that the Germanic National Museum in Nuremberg was very rooted in this notion of Nuremberg as a Germanic city, with all the romanticism, with all the projections that you could apply to this imaginary country. By the time this print was created, it already had become a museum in a politically united Germany as well. But that wasn't on the cards when the museum was first established. And I'm showing you, it's very bold and brave. The fountainhead behind its foundation, Hans von und zu Aufseß, who is shown here in one of the armors that actually was part of the collection, which of course is something we wouldn't allow anymore today. But that's just the way people dress up. This was not his daily standard, but it just shows how identity and how you presented yourself were fused with your notion of a national identity. And as Professor Görner knows much better than me, this idea of Germanic National Museum is not vested to a political unity. It's something that unites peoples, and I'm using peoples with an S, deliberately across political divides, because they have a shared language in which they express their thoughts, their hopes, their dreams, and that by virtue also provides for creating cultures and other expressions of material culture that show a diversity, but also commonalities. From the very beginning, nonetheless, this institution was dedicated to the German nation. And that in itself is something that remains very difficult. And I can be upfront, we're struggling with the name of our institution once in a while. Once in a while we are asked, shouldn't you change it? We think that the benefit wouldn't be there, because what it does, it keeps us on our toes. To have the property of the German nation written above your main entrance will raise questions, and you will have to answer them, you will have to explore them with your audiences, whoever they might be. And just to show you how we're doing this at the moment, we currently have an art festival, the so-called Global Art Festival, which brings together artists from Nuremberg, from Germany, but also big international names. And they all meet here and think about Nuremberg and its very checkered and extreme history. And they also think about the history of the Germanic National Museum and respond to it. And I find this response, which currently is superimposed on a nation on our entrance area, which says nation in Germany is maybe still, and has always been a fiction, an imagination, going back to Engels' idea. Of course, this is something we could talk about a long time, but it just shows how ongoing that interrogation and challenge is to respond to that and to find a way as a national institution, because Germany has retained this very federal structure with lots of small, strong regions, the Bundesländer, the states that still are very strong in Germany and influence the museum culture. I could spend hours talking to you about the subsequent history, fast forwarding through the First, the Second World War, and many other places. And of course, I'm showing you the facade of the Victoria and Albert Museum to show that the war has affected museums and institutions in both countries. Both wars have. They have affected whom we work for, how we collect, where collections were stored. But the difference, I think, is that in Germany, institutions were challenged at a very fundamental level, and there were so many restarts with every new part of history, from 1917-18, the revolution and monarchy being abolished, to 1933-45, the terrible years of National Socialism, the restart of 1945, and then in 1990, reunification, which has once more challenged, especially museums in the Eastern states, to rethink who they are and who their audiences can be, how they can reach them. Now let's take a step back from the wall of the V&A on Exhibition Road and look at what we actually have to do, what we have in both countries at the moment. And at first glance, these figures are astonishingly different, I should say. So Great Britain has 2,500 museums at the moment, as in contrast, Germany has, and that's German accuracy at its best, 6,834. They are counted by the museum councils in Germany very exactly. So why is that the case? And I have to admit, I can't give you an exact answer. One very basic thing to know is that the official numbers in Great Britain count museums that have undergone the so-called accreditation process. So they are officially accredited by the arts councils and similar mentioned in the various British nations, whereas in Germany there is no accreditation process, and hence the numbers are raised by museum councils, but everybody qualifies. There are estimates that if you also include museums that are not accredited in the UK, you end up with a figure of about 4,000 museums. Give and take, we will not know. Anyway, it's quite a lot of museums. I calculated that if I decided as part of my professional development, I should really visit each museum in Germany, I'd probably need about 22 years. So I'd finish just in time for retirement. But so realistically, and that's something you have to keep in mind, there is no one who can aspire to see them all. And you have a massive amount of choice, but you also have to choose, because whether you're in the UK or in Germany, you will not be able to see them all. One question I've actually been wondering about is, when we compare museums in Great Britain and Germany, are we actually comparing apples and pears? Should we really do it? Or is it something that doesn't really work? And I just list here a couple of aspects that might come into play when thinking about this. And I would like to invite you to keep them in mind as we now go through one or two case studies, just to see how that might play out at a national institution, at a smaller institution. It's the question, how are you actually organized? What are we tasked to do as public institutions? Where do our funding bodies see the most important aspect of our work, and how has that changed over time? Business models, what role do commercial activities play? Staffing, numbers, which departments are they in? Do we have more curators or do we have more people in IT? All this plays into time. And I think location, I will go into that in a bit more detail, is a really crucial factor. Which cities do you have? How much tourism do they attract? And I'm not telling you a secret if I tell you Nürnberg, of course, has less pulling ability than London when it comes to tourism. And that all of these factors come into play. I think the last two that I'm listing are particularly relevant. One is language. What a luxury to have English as your first language and as maybe the only language you really need to use as a museum. German museums, by and large, always have bilingual inscriptions, which makes life much more difficult in many ways, but also it's very beautiful because it forces you to think for two different types of audiences and two different needs in terms of the information you provide. And entrance fees is the really big issue that's been discussed quite a lot over the last 20 years since the National Museums in the UK introduced free admission for the permanent displays. I think by now we now feel that maybe that hasn't as much of an impact on numbers that might count, or isn't really maybe such a good way to increase visitor numbers long term as people had hoped for a long time. Just to show you two of the smaller institutions, which also show the different types of institutions you can find in both countries. On the left-hand side, you're in beautiful Upper Bavaria with one of the many open-air museums, which is run by the district of Upper Bavaria. So for me, it stands and is exemplary for that very strong local identity that Germans still feel. We would still describe ourselves rather as Bavarian, Franconian, Saxonian, than really saying we are German. That's actually, I do remember at school, you would describe yourself as Bavarian, maybe as European, but you'd be slightly reluctant to say I'm German. That's just the generation that I come from. And it would be interesting to see Jana, you're like younger than me, whether that's your experience as well. And on the other side, of course, you've already recognized Chatsworth, which is still the estate of the Dukes of Devonshire, the Cavendish family, and is one of those princely collections in the UK which are open to the public, which are part of a successful, commercially successful estate, but might not be listed as a museum even, but play a huge part in preserving heritage in the UK. No, I touched a bit about accreditation. The UK has it, Germany has it not. We have, depending on which state you are in, we have museum consultancy agencies, so a bit like Arts Council, which are dedicated to supporting so-called non-state museums, so museums which have a governance that's not run by the council, not run by the state of Bavaria or the state of Baden-Württemberg, but have their funding from other public bodies or from charitable bodies. They are supported in terms of creating their permanent exhibition. And I can talk about this a bit because for a year before starting at the Germanic National Museum, I worked for the Bavarian Museum Consultancy Agency, which has the wonderful German name of the Landesstelle für die nichtstaatlichen Museen in Bayern. I don't think a very good translation has been found yet. And what they really excel at is at creating beautiful, utterly professional, permanent galleries for smaller and smallest museums. And what you see in front of you is on the left-hand side, das Ludwig Erhard House in Fürth, near Nürnberg. So Ludwig Erhard, one of the first ministers who was behind the Wirtschaftswunder and the recovery of Germany in economic terms after the Second World War. And that opened just a couple of years ago. And on the other hand, this is also, again, for the language fans, this is a house or museum dedicated to Erika Fuchs. And you might recognize Donald Duck in the background. She is the famous translator of Donald Duck comics into German. And you might wonder, why on earth am I telling you that? Because these are dedications that receive a fairly sizable amount of investment upfront. And the one thing that we sometimes find museums are then struggling with, and which is something that all museums struggle with anyway, is to fund ongoing operations. And that is a challenge on both sides of the channel, independent of accreditation processes. It's one thing to create a museum, it's the other one to run it, to keep it lively, to make sure that people will return. The first visit is easy. The second, the third, to become the favorite museum of somebody, that is the really challenge in an institution. And that's particularly difficult when people can hardly come because of a pandemic, or when you don't have staff to keep your exhibitions fresh and contribute new knowledge and ideas. So we've got a huge number of museums in Germany, more than in the UK, independent of whether we have the lower or the higher figure that I just presented. I think the federal structure has something to do with it. We have smaller museums, we have smaller cities. London, of course, is this extraordinary attraction and this world city that attracts people from everywhere, and then having free admission is another incentive to visit. So whereas German museums will have visitor numbers in six-figure areas, London museums quite often have figures in the millions. And I brought along this little top 20 of European museums, comparing visitor numbers from 2019, before COVID, and 2020, during COVID. So you can see the lighter blue is the 2019 figure. The Louvre reigns supreme. None of us can reach them, nearly 10 million visitors per year. But then the really important message to take away is that 6 of the top 20 museums in Europe are in London, and none, really none, is in Germany. This is, of course, as a German museum professional, the moment when I say, hang on, visitor numbers are not everything. But as we all know, you always challenge, you always ask how many people get through your doors. And in turn, if they go to special exhibitions in national museums in the UK, and if they come to us at all, they will help us raise the funds for other projects, and especially temporary exhibitions. How does that play out? I brought along 2 little case studies to explore this, both of them set in London and Berlin respectively, because I find it, as I said, it's really difficult to find institutions that are comparable. And I have to admit that even here, one of the takeaways will be, we can only compare them so far. So the first set is the easier one, which is the Natural History Museums in London, which was split from the British Museum in the 1880s, and the Natural History Museum in Berlin, which interestingly enough is run by Professor Johannes Vogel, who used to work at the Natural History Museum in London for many years before moving back to Germany. And I think if you look at the 2 websites, you can, I know it might be difficult on your screen, you can immediately see that the Natural History Museum is talking to its audience. And it's very brave in using Harry Potter, Fantastic Beasts, The Wonder of Nature, as a way to address a topical issue about protecting wildlife, about protecting rare animals, whereas it has to be said, the Naturkunde Museum has chosen to give a look behind the scenes, which maybe talks as much to me as a peer and co-museum professional as it might or might not to somebody who wants to go there and find something that inspires them, that challenges their views of the world. I should say the Leibniz Museum für Naturkunde is the Museum für Naturkunde in Berlin is a Leibniz research museum, just as the Germanisches Nationalmuseum. It's a select group, I should say, of 8 institutions across Germany, only one of them dedicated to art and culture, that are tasked with contributing top-level research in the respective fields and combine it with the transfer that Professor Görner mentioned earlier on, making it accessible to the public. And at the moment, the big topic we're working on is digitization, is improving our learning and interpretation offers. So that on top of top research, we can also offer top interpretation. And quite often as it is, we look to Great Britain to find inspiration and colleagues who help us getting better and improving the offers we can make to different audiences. If you look at the figures, of course, you can see 5.1 million visitors at the Natural History Museum in London. 734 is still very, very good for Germany, but nothing in comparison. And that is actually that if you break it down, you can see that they're both very similar in terms of vintage. They were created and their buildings also date from Victorian times. Their collections differ in size, probably also because they have a different remit, as it were. There are other institutions collecting natural history at a similar comparable scale in Germany, whereas the Natural History Museum in London is the one institution in the UK offering it. I think it's quite interesting if you look at their missions, which sort of underlines what I already said about the ever so slightly different focus and communication. Whereas the natural history says they want to create advocates for the planet, which looks at what we can do, how we can inspire people. The Natural History Museum in Berlin emphasizes its research. Actually, 3 times the word research pops up. We erforschen die Erde, we research the planet. And of course, then transfer the dialogue with people is something that is also mentioned. And then again, research museum, academic and scholarly scientific dialogue. So it's interesting that even so, institutions in both countries do both at a very, very high level. The communication that we feel we need to do also in order to make sure we're seen as a top level institution still slightly differs. And I suspect if we, and I know if we would compare the Germanisches Nationalmuseum with an institution in the UK, you would find a similar picture. We're aware of that. We're working on finding the balance between those two. I mentioned it earlier before, here we are now. We cannot end our the lecture tonight without looking at the Humboldt Forum in Berlin. And I absolutely shy away from that, but I feel we still at least have to touch upon it because it is such a complicated story, which I think even people working for can only describe as a work in process. Whereas the British Museum, which I've chosen as a counterpart, of course, is this institution with this century-long history, which seems very settled and very clear, but of course we all know it's not, and the challenges, especially over the last years, regarding post-colonial questions, regarding questions about access to various people, are increasingly coming into focus. I've chosen that comparison as well because once more we have here an institution where a director moved from one institution to the other. So as I'm sure you know, Neil McGregor moved from being the director of the British Museum to becoming one of the founding directors, if I can use the word, as Intendant, Gründungsintendant was the German term for the Humboldt Forum. And the Humboldt Forum, of course, is the reconstruction, reinvention of the Berlin city palace, which we saw in the 1848 picture. So this is from 1848, fast forward to 2021. This is where we are. I thought it's quite interesting in terms of thinking about how they present themselves online, that the British Museum says we're showing 2 million years of human history and culture. It's an all-encompassing claim. And the Humboldt Forum in comparison is very modest by saying we are just a new piece of Berlin. So that in itself I find quite endearing and interesting. One of the fundamental differences, in my opinion, is also that the British Museum is the nucleus of what eventually became many different institutions. So the British Museum has started with the collections of Hans Sloane, a physicist and scientist, but also somebody who was a plantation owner in Jamaica. So already there we have those questions which are becoming relevant and difficult and challenging at the moment. And this has then turned into many different national museums. The British Library is now part of it. I think the National Gallery was originally part of the British Museum, and most certainly the Natural History Museum. Whereas the Humboldt Forum in Berlin tries to do something that's exactly the opposite. It brings together 6 different institutions under one roof. And if you then compare the figures, which is much more difficult, of course, because the Humboldt Forum has only opened this year, 5.9 million visitors in the British Museum, unbelievable figures. Whereas we just need to see how the Humboldt Forum will be faring. I'd like to draw your attention again to the last paragraph, which again compares what they not missions, but guiding principles. Both institutions use that term. The British Museum wants respect for collaboration, openness and understanding, preserving and sharing the collections, so the collections at the core of the institution for present and future generation. The Humboldt Forum actually echoes that to some extent, but it goes further. The collections do not play such an important role anymore that they are mentioned. They are there, they are crucial, you couldn't do without them. But what I find really interesting, and of course they now have to pay the price for putting that in their guiding principles, but it's also very exciting, is actually they want to be a space for controversy. So all the controversial debates we're currently having about the Humboldt Forum, they are built into the structure. And it's meant to be, the stress test would be, can the Humboldt Forum actually deal with that and handle it? And how will it evolve as an institution or a set of institutions under that guiding principle? It's quite an interesting and ongoing development. And I brought along this because already before it opened and before the building was finished, claims about repatriation, colonial questions came to the fore. And there is an absolute lead in Germany to address those. The Holocaust, of course, still is something we need to address and work with. And we do this in our institution. Nürnberg is a city that as a whole town tackles this and tries to find the right way of memory culture to make this knowledge and the lessons learned available to a new generation. But colonial questions therefore have slightly taken the backseat, or very much taken the backseat in German museums so far. And combined with that is of course the question, who has the right to interpret the collections we hold? And there's a very beautiful German word, but I'm not sure it's beautiful, but it's very German, Deutungshoheit. And I've been trying to find an English equivalent, and I'm curious what Professor Görner and Jana will suggest. I came up with the idea is it's the authority or the prerogative to interpret collections. Who is allowed to have a say in that? And of course, increasingly, the source communities play a role in that, in readdressing, re-evaluating collections across time. But I found it quite telling that there is no English equivalent for Deutungshoheit. That is the point where we can turn to special exhibitions. So far, we've been speaking about museums, shells, places as buildings, places as digital realms where people meet, talk about collection, to see them, to enjoy them, to interrogate them. But most of those exhibitions have a longer lifespan, 10, 20, in our case, sometimes 30, 40 years, whereas a special exhibition that runs for only 6 to 9 months can be much more precise and challenging and tackling the questions of its time. And I think that's where a real power lies, and why we as institutions shouldn't move away from them, but should nurture them. And I think that's also where collaborations between Great Britain and Germany can and have always been particularly fruitful and relevant. I brought along Dürer Journeys, which had 2 lives, one in Aachen, Aix-la-Chapelle, a very comparatively small museum, and now is moving to the National Gallery. And you might have heard about the discussion about Christ among the scholars, whether or not it is acceptable to show this painting in the exhibition nowadays without commenting on the anti-Semitism that is apparent in the picture. So these also offer a forum to address current questions and issues. Exhibitions also have the power to work where political diplomacy cannot go anymore. I just want to remind you of the 2010, I think, exhibition, The Enlightenment, which the Dresden State Museum sent to China when on a political level, no negotiation was possible. But with that very soft, in a very soft way, we could share the values of democracy and freedom through a cultural exhibition. And that is the real power of traveling exhibitions, touring exhibitions, and collaborative exhibitions. Of course, they have a downside as well. They are among the most expensive and least sustainable products museums can create. Just think of courier travel, think of the architecture sometimes built for 3 or 6 months only, or just think about the whole idea of objects traveling from one side of the world to the other, and all that entails in terms of risk for the object, but also in terms of challenge for the climate. This brings me back to where we stand now between England and Germany. We do not have, there's some programs and some grants that have fallen away for the moment because of Brexit, but thankfully AHRC and DFG, Deutsche Forschungsgesellschaft, have just started a call for joint Anglo-German museum projects. So that is something we can work with, and I find it extremely exciting, and hope that a lot of fantastic cooperations will come from that. But of course, the institutions that have helped museums to work together on exhibitions and shared content on both sides of the channels, they still exist, and they're still as strong as they have ever been, and still as supportive. And I'm just choosing 2 examples to show you that this is across the span of collections. So you have contemporary interpretations of Burns Monument in Edinburgh, co-financed by the Institut für Auslandsbeziehungen, IFA, in Germany, and the Goethe Institute, and you have British Council and the Arts Council under the umbrella of the National Museum Directors Council, making sure that the world can know about the fantastic treasures and collections available in the UK. I don't think we have anything similar in Germany at the moment, but we probably should work towards having a brochure where you can look up which institutions might be available. So that's just a little tip on the side, hint on the side. That, in closing, brings me to what I promised earlier. So we talked about Brexit and COVID as the challenges that occupy us a lot at the moment, but which hopefully we can overcome and take something positive with them. There are 2 to 3 challenges which will and have to change the way we work in the future as museums and exhibition galleries, and they have to change them quite fundamentally, I believe. And one of them is, of course, climate change, and the whole question of sustainable museum activities, from exhibitions to the energy we use in our buildings, to staff travel, and we have to contribute to that. But I also truly believe that we have the potential through our collections and the memories they preserve to offer a perspective on climate change that helps us looking forward in terms of the topics and subjects we can choose for our exhibitions and for our online and on-site activities and events and offers. The other one is, I'm aware the icon might be slightly difficult to understand. That is, of course, diversity, the people we have in our institutions. Of course, these institutions have a long tradition of being middle class, of being very white, sometimes even male. I definitely can't say that for the Germanic National Museum. We're very diverse in that respect. But there is still a lot of space to develop in, and to make sure that people from all walks of life, and irrespective of their race, their gender, and anything else, feel welcome and wanted at museums as audiences, but also as a workforce. And actually, the Leibniz Research Museums are now tackling that. We're offering scholarships for post-migrant students. We offer other opportunities for exchanges with the Global South, etc., to ensure that we are getting more diverse, and that this Deutungshoheit becomes a Deutungspluralität, which is becomes a range of perspectives and of different people looking together at collections and at the issues of the day. And I think there's a little side aspect that needs to be addressed as well. There are less and less people who choose to go into a museum career, even in the well-established museum sectors. And of course, they're horrified by reading about the changes in the UK museum sector over the last year, with so many redundancies. They're also horrified at times when they realize, even if they have a job, what that might mean in comparison, for example, to a university career in terms of life-work balance, etc. And these are all issues which I truly believe we have to address, because that brings me back. We need places, whether they're actually physical buildings or online or in any other shape or form. We need perspectives, but we need people, and we need people who know about collections and who know about all the other aspects of museum work. But if we lose the knowledge on, let's say, decorative arts, and I know some of you might have thought, God, she's specialized in gold boxes or mosaics. That might sound very niche, but you need people like me who know about that and are prepared to dedicate a life to that. It takes a long time to learn these things. And I think if we create exciting programs and if we continue doing that on both sides of the channel, then that will help us to survive as institutions. And with that, also to ensure that the material culture and cultural heritage, natural history, etc., we guard and we protect can survive for the next generations and audiences to enjoy and to interpret. And I think that's all I want to share at the moment. Thank you very much. And I can see there are a couple of questions in the chat. So Jana, I think you will help me get through them, work through them. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Heike Zech, for this fascinating presentation. It was truly rich in many, many ways. And to confirm what you assume, yes, we certainly need you. We need people like yourselves to actually make it plain to us all, just how important it is to not just visit museums, but also be aware of the function of museums in our so-called post-industrial society or societies. Indeed, for me, there is no need at all to ask bridging questions here before the audience chips in, because the chat has already been extremely active. And one, not bone of contention, but one very interesting topic was, of course, your concept of Deutungshoheit that you introduced here. And indeed, it ranges from the authority to interpret to very much the sovereignty of interpretation, as Astrid Köhler quoted from another source. It is indeed surprising that in the German concept we have this very, very elevated concept of Hoheit, Deutungshoheit. This is not just interpretation, this is infinitely more than that. And I like very much also your suggestion to speak of a plurality of interpretation, a plurality of Deutung. So the museum as a place where these things happen, where we can get the plurality of interpreting the past, and of course also indicators of what is going to happen in the future. I think you have illustrated this absolutely brilliantly. And we have also comments here in the chat suggesting that the audience was glued to your screen, to your presentation, and attentively listening to what you had to say. Now, I suppose we can simply start with some of the questions here. And the first question has to do with the cultural management of museums in Britain. They have mastered this cultural management, so the comment goes, and cultural marketing. They can run museums like businesses with a firm focus on the visitors and their requirements. Does the German museum sector emphasize this aspect? And perhaps in conjunction with this, when we look at the way in which museums are run here in Britain as businesses, what about corporate sponsorship? I think this is something which one also needs to put into the equation. But over to you.
Absolutely, that's a very, very good topic. It would deserve its own lecture, to be honest. And I had to put much more of an emphasis on that in an earlier stage of my presentation. Of course, it's true that the commercial aspect of British museums, especially the large national museums, is much more evolved, I would say, than it is by and large in German museums. Of course, there is a large variety. If I speak to some of the institutions that I have had the pleasure to work as a consultant for, or that I know as a member of the team, we do know we should run our institutions as businesses, and to some extent we can. But there is a certain limit of what is possible within the type of governance and trust or foundation model that most of our institutions have. And that sort of limits to some extent in how far we can increase our number of staff in a certain area, let's say commercial activities, or let's say IT, online activities, because we feel it's necessary to target a certain market or to reach wider audiences. But we're definitely learning from the British and the American museums in that respect. And it's absolutely clear that the museums that excel at doing that in Germany are extremely successful. I'm just thinking, for example, of the Städel in Frankfurt, which was run by Max Hollein, who's now director of the Metropolitan Museum, and who really turned that institution in a business. But obviously we all are businesses to some degree, but it's a super question because it points the finger to an area of development.
Yes, crucial indeed. Yeah. Thank you for that. We have a complex question by John Goodyear here, three-part question. Thinking of museums as places of education, Bildung, and also of in-house training, what role does Museumspädagogik play at the Germanisches Nationalmuseum? Second point, how is the impact of Museumspädagogik measured and evaluated at your museum? And final point, how will digitalization, in your opinion, impact the future direction of Museumspädagogik? So here we have the educational side of things.
Educational side, that's a very good point. I do remember when I came from Great Britain, actually when I applied for my job at the V&A, I was asked, can you tell us what our British museum, what is the V&A better than the Germanisches? And I said, it's learning, because they have a much, and it really, at that time it was. And likewise, I can say that we are really catching up and working very hard. And we are in a very unique position in that we have our staff at the Germanisches is about 220 people, give and take. But we nonetheless have a learning center of about 80 people. Now you will wonder how that is possible. It's possible because 50 years ago, the city of Nürnberg and the Germanic National Museum decided to establish their own learning center. And that's pretty much the glory days of Museumspädagogik in Germany. And it was a very avant-garde and visionary center indeed. And that allows us to still have a fairly large number of specialist educators who can cater for all sorts of audiences. And we have a huge focus on doing that. And the other aspect, which touches upon the digital as well, that as Leibniz Research Institution, we are part of a fantastic 4-year scheme, the so-called Aktionsplan Vermittlung, Action Plan Learning. That's a very, not the best translation, but it's a super project in which the 8 Leibniz Research Museums have dedicated specialist teams currently on contracts that help us rethink our interpretation online and on site, and to evaluate, to establish new procedures that allow us to get a better sense of what people need and how we're doing in offering them what they need, both online and on site. And of course, it was a God-given during the first closure last year during the pandemic to have that team on site, because they managed to up our interpretation online within a couple of months. So we now have a YouTube channel with dedicated videos for kids, which are very popular among all age groups. We understand we're experimenting with different digital models, from online, from guided tours to digital stories, etc. So there's a lot happening, and jointly with the universities and other Leibniz research institutes, we're continuing to evaluate the success of that. I don't want to lie, of course, as always, we can do even more and we can do better. And at the moment, our biggest worry and our fear is actually that this 4-year project will run out, and we have reached now a certain level that we feel is adequate, necessary, and can still evolve, that then funding will fall by the wayside, and we will fall back to the previous era of more limited means, especially for digital interpretation and content.
So the question
answers John's question to some extent.
Right, yes, I think you also responded in again to the previous question regarding responding to the demands, as it were, of the public. I think that's fascinating. The next question comes from the director of the Goethe Institute here in London, Katharina von Ruckteschell. And she asked you whether you could say a few words on the subject of restitution and the way it is dealt with in the British Museum, for example, and the Humboldt Forum. What are differences there?
Well, I think the differences are, I mean, you have to differentiate, first of all, between restitution regarding the period 1933 to 1945, so the Holocaust Act in Great Britain and what was the Limbach Commission and now has changed into in Germany, where all museums look back at the Washington Conference and the Washington Declaration of 1998, but they're in terms of national law and national approaches, there are differences, but you have in both countries a foundation that allows museums to return objects from their collection, because as we all know, the basic problem is that more often than not, museums do not have the permission to give away the objects from their collection because these are owned by the public. We're not free to do with them what we want and to decide to dispose into accession just because somebody says it could be mine. So there needs to be a much larger test. I suppose when it comes to British Museum and Humboldt Forum, of course, we're looking at very different regions, we're looking at different time spans, we're looking at colonial periods. So the Elgin marbles, for example, reached the British Museum already in the early 19th century. If we're thinking about the collection, which are now under debate in Berlin, Luftboot, etc., they are all very individual cases, and I slightly shy away from trying to draw a general conclusion. But I suppose in both cases, what is true is that you have to look at cases individually, and that in both cases, politics plays a role as much as research and scholarship. I hope that in a way, I know it's maybe not the direct and clear answer that Katharina was hoping for, but it is complicated.
It is complicated. Thank you very much indeed. The next question comes from Sylvia McGowan, and it is regarding the role, the topic and the role of museums in health and well-being, particularly thinking of involvement in social prescribing programs in the UK, and if Germany has any similar cross-sector initiatives. Perhaps also in the background is the Wellcome Institute, etc., etc.
Absolutely, yeah. One of my favorite programs in the UK has always been Museums Change Lives. And there's simply nothing similar in Germany at the moment, but there are quite a lot of people who are aware of these programs and the implementation and understanding the role of museums in improving people's lives and well-being. And I think that the Deutsche Museumsbund is one of them. And certainly at the last meetings that I attended, we always tend to look to be honest, we look to the UK examples and think about how can we implement something similar in Germany. So watch that space. I think we are in pursuit and will follow suit.
Thank you, thank you. Yes, we have Edward Hughes and his question regarding the following. How do you see the linkage between commercialization and the working of curation? And secondly, how might the notion of a space for controversy be linked to, squared with, notions of financial management?
Yes, so this is in a way about playing to the audience and whom do you need to serve? And of course, it's the eternal question that you need to be appealing to those who give you the money that you need in order to appeal to other people who might not have the money, and that their needs might be slightly different. I'm head of exhibitions here at the Germanic National Museum, and maybe that's a good way of comparing how we go about choosing exhibition topics at the GNM in comparison to other institutions. And when I first started, the question was how marketable is an exhibition? Was certainly nothing that would have been asked. It was more about a unique, new, fresh subject that could change people's mind. And the idea of the blockbuster exhibition, of course, the Dürer exhibition I showed you, Dürer is the most reliable blockbuster name you can think of. I suppose any museum that has to rely on blockbuster exhibitions in order to raise the funds through visitor numbers to then run its business is a bit poorer in other respects for that fact, because in my opinion, what I really enjoy, and actually the Wellcome collection is for me as an example, point in case, I will go to any exhibition they have, regardless of its title, because I just know they will do something wonderful. And if you manage with your exhibition program to reach that kind of profile, that you can mix an obvious blockbuster name with something surprising and new, and people will still come and pay for it, then that is actually the best you can hope for. In terms of the space for controversy, well, notions of financial management, that is a good point. Do you actually want to attract controversy? Is that something that people want to see, and does it actually bring in money? I think it's something to do with being perceived as authentic and trustworthy as an institution, and that, in my opinion, means being open to opinions that are challenging and might challenge some of the audiences. And we have this balance at the Germanic National Museum all the time as well. We have the very traditional conservative clientele who love to come and see the Dürer, but we also increasingly work with communities of second generation Turkish, Italian families, for whom the idea of a Germanic National Museum is absolutely in contrast to that. And sometimes they will not easily go along with one another, but it's still, I feel, as long as you retain the balance and everybody has the feeling, here was something that surprised me, something new and worth coming to, that might still work. But of course, it might have an impact on the amount, on raising funds through ticketing. I hope I sort of answered that question to some extent. It might have gone in a completely different direction, in which case I hope you will let me know and we can continue discussing that here or on a different format.
Thank you very much. Now, the next question comes from Angus. Over to you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, sorry, I would rather ask it by talking rather than typing it, because it's rather a complicated question. Thank you very much for your talk. What I've been really interested in following the debates about the Humboldt Forum, and maybe it's because I'm a Germanist and I follow these debates more closely in Germany than I do in the UK, but I find that the German debate about the Humboldt Forum has been much more detailed and at a much higher level, I would say, in terms of the number of participants and also the different parts of the debate, to debates that I've witnessed about the colonial legacy of the British Museum, for example, in the UK. And I wonder whether that is because of what you mentioned before, that the British Museum is a very established institution, whereas what they're doing with the Humboldt Forum is actually something completely new, and they're establishing, you know, a collection based upon largely colonial, if not directly, then indirectly, objects in the 21st century. So I was wondering whether you'd also observed that difference in the types of debate that have been going on in the UK and Germany about this post-colonial legacy, because I find that very interesting. Personally, I'm very interested in this because I'm working on German anthropologists who went to Australia around 1900, and they collected not only objects, but also body parts problematically. It's a very, very difficult and, you know, controversial area to get into.
Absolutely, I can see why that would be the case. I think I agree with you. It's really a very detailed debate, and I think it's a very healthy debate to have. Of course, it's painful for everybody at the Humboldt Forum who's just curated an exhibition, created a permanent display, and now every bit of it is challenged. But it's absolutely necessary, and this type of problem or challenge and necessary discussion has been overlooked in Germany to some extent, but now it's becoming, well, not mainstream, but there is a huge number of people, different stakeholders, source communities, universities, etc., who all taking an interest and developing it. So just to give you an example, 3 of my interns, and I have about 1 intern a year, just to give you an example, and they all have written their master theses on subjects related to that, on post-colonial museums, on the Krassi Museum in Leipzig, for example, is a case study, and its ethnological collections. So this is something where maybe we feel we have a lot to do and to catch up. And I think it's fantastic that there is so much discussion around it. because in the long run, I feel the Humboldt Forum will benefit from it, and all the other institutions with similar holdings as well.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angus. We have two more questions in the chat, and with that, I would actually close the list. The next question comes from Daniel Hess regarding the role of entrance fees.
I should disclose that Daniel Hess is my colleague. He's the Director General of the Germanisches Nationalmuseum, and we talk about this quite a lot. So I'm very happy to try and repeat the general debate. So quite a long time, actually, German museums were saying maybe we need free entrance as well in order to ensure we can increase our reach of audiences who maybe find €8 in our case too much to pay, which is, of course, it is a lot of money for some people, and they should have a right to see museums too. I think that recent studies in the UK have shown that maybe free admission, at least nowadays, is not as transformatory in terms of attendance as it might have used to be 20 years ago. I can say to that, in London, I was the curator of the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert collection at the V&A, which started out as an independent museum, which did not have free entrance. And within a year, its visitor numbers dropped to negligible numbers when free admission was introduced in UK museums. And obviously it reduces the thinking that needs to go into whether you attend or not. But you might not always attend because you want to see the museum. You all remember the V&A campaign, which actually predates the introduction of free entrance. It's an Ace Cafe with a museum attached. But museums, the national museums in the UK, are spaces where people meet, not necessarily to look at collections, but to have a fantastic, inspiring environment, to do some shopping, gift shopping, etc., to have fantastic cafe offers and opportunities. And as soon as you actually go to a special exhibition, you do have to pay. So the free entrance and the free admission is something that only applies to the permanent galleries. But nonetheless, I feel that trying to at least make free entrance available easily, so let's say quite affordably priced annual memberships, etc., is still something that can help to create maybe not the top visitor numbers. We never have 6 million visitors per year at the Germanic National Museum. I think we have to live with that. But what we can create through affordable annual tickets is people who say, this is my favorite museum, this is where I go to meet people, this is where I go because it clears my mind, because I feel better for it. And I think that is the power. There are, of course, academic studies, I should say, that prove benefits and actually say it doesn't have that much of an impact anymore. But I suppose the reality is that with the business models, if I can use the word, of German museums, free admission is maybe not in the cards, but affordable annual tickets. Yeah.
Thank you. And the final question from Matthew Scholl. Would you say there is an overarching museums culture in Germany? I run an art gallery, and I think that one of the characteristics of UK museums and gallery culture is participation, and that this can almost be more important than the quality of what we show. In Germany, by contrast, I often encounter a huge appreciation for concepts and ideas, which, because funding in the UK is so instrumental, is becoming more difficult to achieve or has to be achieved by a subterfuge. So over to you.
It's a good point. I just want to make sure I understand the question correctly. So it's about the idea, participation is, of course, key. It takes us back to Deutungshoheit, however we might translate it. I feel that concepts, narratives, and ideas are still something we are very proud of in German museums. And I realize when I compare exhibition narratives in the UK and in Germany, and that applies to permanent galleries as much as to temporary exhibitions, I sometimes have the feeling that the German exhibitions always have yet another level you can dive into, whereas exhibitions in UK museums often have an additional level that is participation. And both is a valid approach. I feel you can also combine them, and the best exhibitions do. I should say that participation is currently something that becomes increasingly important for gaining and attracting funding in Germany as well. And I'm currently working on an exhibition on migration, for which we have been lucky enough to get additional funding and from the Deutsche Museumsbund, so the German equivalent of the Museums Association, because it combines a very, as I hope, a very valid narrative and concept with participation with migrant and post-migrant communities here in Nuremberg and around it. So I feel that maybe the vibe that you sense is dissolving slowly. Maybe that's helpful.
Thank you so much, Heike Zech. I think we have really experienced a truly enriching lecture tonight. And I dare say also the liveliness of what happened in the chat, the questions to you, reflect our measure of the sheer quality that you have presented us with in your talk. Highly illuminating, and I think you made us think about topics which perhaps we normally don't necessarily forefront when we discuss Anglo-German cultural relations, but you have demonstrated just how crucial this particular aspect of our relations really is. So thank you very much for this. Thank you for attending. Thank you for your very prompting and challenging questions. And I would like to conclude simply by inviting you all to our next lecture, which will be in the new year. On the 18th of January, we will have John Guthrie on Johann Jakob Bodmer's translation of Milton's Paradise Lost. I think this also demonstrates the sheer plurality of interpretation when it comes to Anglo-German cultural relations. Have a good and hopefully healthy festive season, and a good and healthy transition into the new year. And thank you again, Heike Zech, for this marvelous talk. All the best. Bye for now.